In the 1940s in America, house fires were much more common than they are today. Corruption was rampant, and children who went missing were much less likely to be found. So what happens when all of these outdated terrors culminate into one story? 5 children go missing, the fire chief lies, bones are buried to cover up, and you get the greatest conspiracy of the 1940s, the mystery of the Sodder family. I'm Adam, thanks for watching Informal History, and I want to dive into one of the most captivating stories of missing people that maybe they're missing, maybe they're not. A whole different category of missing. Are they dead or alive? Does anybody know what actually happened to them? In the first decade of the 1900s, immigration of many Europeans into the United States by way of ship into Ellis Island was on the rise. In numbers, Italian immigrants arrived, and they contributed to a rapid growth of a still young nation across the Atlantic from their home country. Italy in the early 1900s was led by a fascist government ruling over the Italians that dare not speak ill of the regime. But once immigrated, opinions opened up and became more vocal, often leading to circumstances where the return to Italy would not be possible, and the Italian faithful would become bitter. Giorgio Sodder was one of the immigrants on one of those ships 13 years after his birth in 1895. He later changed his name to George Sodder to fit in, to assimilate more easily in his new home of the United States. And George found work early in life on the railroads. Working on the railroads was very common, an easy way in to earn money in the United States if you were an immigrant. Even if you were still learning the language, employment was possible. Years later, George found himself in Smithers, West Virginia, as a driver, and shortly after, he started his own trucking company. George's trucking company became very successful. He's now a business owner, and he met and married Jenny Cipriani in 1922. That year, in Fayetteville, West Virginia, a town that is known for a large Italian immigrant population, the two settled down and started a family. They resided in a 2-story timber-framed home, and as the family grew, so did George's distaste for Italy and their dictator, Benito Mussolini. This was an opinion that George grew louder and louder about, and not everybody was happy about it. On many occasions, it was accounted that George would become enraged in intense arguments with other Italian immigrants who didn't feel the same way that he did about the dictator in Italy. Keep in mind, during this time, Italians were seen as a different race of people altogether, so division between them, although not uncommon, was a much bigger deal. In 1945, door-to-door sales were a part of life. You'd often get a knock at the door and somebody would try to sell you something. And when a life insurance salesman turned up at the door of the Sodder family, George brushed him off quickly. And after a brief look around the house, the insurance salesman warned George that the wiring in the fuse box was terrible. It was faulty, and it would result in the house going up in smoke and the destruction of all of his children. Words the insurance salesman seemed to pick very carefully. George knew the salesman was Italian. He knew he wasn't impressed that George wouldn't let him close the sale, and George knew that the salesman did not have the same views of the regime in Italy at the time. Shortly after this interaction, the Sodder children noticed a car, a mysterious car, parked up the street every day. The occupants watching the younger Sodder children going to and coming from school. On Christmas Eve 1945, as every American family did, the Sodder family was beginning to celebrate Christmas. They were staying up a little bit later than they normally would, lights on in the house, Christmas lights twinkling for everyone that's passing by to marvel at. One by one, the family members retired to bed, and at 12:30 in the morning, the phone rang and was answered by Jenny Sodder. George's wife recalled hearing on the other end of the phone an unfamiliar female voice, cackling in an odd, sinister way. Jenny hung up, closed the curtains, and she went back to bed. Jolted awake 30 minutes later, Jenny recalls hearing something hard hit the top of the roof and start to wheel its way down, like a canister tumbling down the slope. Jenny then fell asleep, but a very short time later awoke again to the smell of smoke. She got up and investigated. She went upstairs to George's study and found engulfed in flames the fuse box and where the home phone wire was coming into the house. Urgently, she rushed to George. George awoke and awoke all of his oldest sons. He went to the corridor of the attic where the younger children were sleeping upstairs, yelled for them to come down as the flames made it difficult for him to pass. He went downstairs with his children, made sure that his wife was safe, and tried to go back up, but the flames were too much. And as George and Jenny, with their children Marion, Sylvia, John, and George Jr. all stood outside the home, it became apparent that when Marion tried dialing for help, the phone line was cut. It was no longer working. So she ran to the neighbor's house to call for the fire department. George realized he needed to do something as the fire department was not there, and the house started to grow bigger and bigger. Waves of flames. He went to his ladder, which was in the same spot year after year, day after day, but it was missing. So he attempted to climb the side of the house wearing nothing but bare feet and pajamas. He smashed through the window, cutting his arm badly, but he couldn't enter the house. He decided because he had trucks for his business, he would back them up next to the house and climb them, but neither of them would start, even though both of them were running earlier that day. With unbelievable frustration, the 6 Sodders all stood watching their family home burn, and within 45 minutes, the structure fell. A pile of nothing but burning timber continued to smolder for hours and hours, and the fire department didn't arrive until later that morning. Chief F.J. Morris was low on manpower. This is the time of World War II, and this was a common occurrence. It turned out that Morris couldn't even drive his own fire truck, so he was left sitting on his hands, twiddling his thumbs, waiting for somebody to show up capable of driving the vehicle. The firefighters looked through the ash, the remains of the house sitting in the Sodders' basement for hours, trying to find anything that resembled human remains, trying to find something that the devastated family could bury and remember their loved ones. All Morris came up with was a few bones and some organs, and Morris decided not to tell the family, instead putting these little remains that he found into a tin and burying them a short distance away. Morris was embarrassed how long it took to arrive and couldn't bear to tell the family that they had found nothing but remnants of what they thought were human remains. It's likely Morris truly did believe what he found was all that was left of the 5 children. He was just embarrassed, couldn't bear bring this to the parents. So that's it, case closed. A family lost to a fire and the remains not found because they were cremated inside the blaze. Right? Not so fast. Not long after the funeral on January 2nd, the family started to ask questions. If an electrical fire was the cause, how could the family's Christmas lights be on during the beginning of the blaze? Why was the ladder that for years was always in the same spot, leaning against the house, found in an embankment 75 feet away from the house? Why did the telephone repairman tell the family the phone line was in fact cut, not burned or melted? And that phone line that was 14 feet up, who would have done this? Who would have climbed to cut the wire? Was it the same man stealing block and tackle from the property short time before the fire? Well, a man was arrested and admitted to the theft and admitted to cutting the line, but claimed that he thought it was a power line and he had nothing to do with the fire. So who was this man? We'll never know. The identity was never revealed. Jenny became skeptical, thinking, could it be possible that the bodies couldn't have been burned by the circumstances? She believed this because many of the appliances in the home were left intact, fully recognizable. Jenny read of another fire killing 7 people, but leaving skeletal remains of all of them. And when Jenny found animal bones, she started to perform experiments trying to burn them into ash with fire. She failed every time. So she contacted a crematorium. She asked somebody there, is it possible that what the fire marshals told her could have happened? And she learned it wasn't. Human bones don't turn into ash unless they are subject to fire over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit for more than 2 hours. The fire burned much cooler than that on the night and for much less time. And for the years after, Mrs. Sodder tended to a memorial garden that her and George set up right on the spot of the tragic event. And as she tended this garden, she started to wonder, could my children still be out there, alive and well? Evidence became clear that the fire was in fact set deliberately, and a bus driver who passed the home on the Christmas Eve claimed to have seen people throwing balls of fire at the house. During the spring, after the snow melted in 1946, on the property was found a small green rubber ball. not unlike a grenade. Other witnesses claim to have seen the Sodder children themselves. As the fire burned, she had seen the missing children looking out a passing car window. Another woman claimed to have seen the missing children at a truck stop the day after the fire, close to Charleston, eating breakfast that she herself served them. She remarked that there was a car looking suspicious with a Florida license plate in the parking lot that day, and never seen again. Morris was soon found out for putting those remains in the box and then buried, and when it was exhumed, it was found that all that was there were some animal bones and a beef liver. They weren't human remains at all. George hired private investigators. He wrote to the FBI, but nothing really came of these things. And in August 1949, the site was excavated and some vertebrae of a human were found. Finally, some closure upon investigation, for sure these had to be the remains of their children. But they were of a male human aged 17 to 20, and none of the children matched this description at all. It was presumed the bones came from the fill that George used to create the garden in the first place. Flyers were printed, and so was a billboard set up on the site where the house burned. Pictures of the children were put up, and a large cash reward, then doubled soon after, became available with anybody with information leading to a conclusion. Soon after, a hotel operator in Charleston claimed to have seen the children the week after the fire, apparently led by 2 men and 2 women of Italian extraction. She claimed to have tried to speak to one of the children, but one of the men turned hostile and started to scream in Italian. George followed leads all over the country, and in 1967, over 2 decades after the fire, George traveled to Houston to follow it with a woman who claimed Louis Sodder, one of the sons that was missing from the fire, revealed his true identity to her after 1 drink too many. George never got to speak to this man in question, but the police did, and the man said he was drunk and he didn't really mean what he said. It was untrue. He wasn't Louis Sodder. Later that same year, addressed to Mrs. Sodder, in her mailbox she found a picture. This man in his early 30s likely looked just like Louis, and written in that envelope was his name, Louis Sodder. An investigation pursued, but nothing was found, and about a year later, George Sodder tragically passed away. The living Sodder children kept looking and investigating until 2021, when the youngest survivor, Sylvia Sodder Paxton, passed away. So the story lives on. What do you think happened to the Sodder children? Is it possible that there was some sort of backlash because of Mr. Sodder's negative opinion of the Italian regime? Were they just abducted? Were they murdered? Was it something that was happening within the family? Or did they all tragically pass in the fire and their remains were just never found? Let me know in the comments section below, and what video do you want to see next week? I do videos every weekend, so I'll see you in the next one.